Hi, I'm Rob Bogue,
And I'm Terry Bogue.
and today we're here to talk to you about appropriate vulnerability. And notice the word appropriate. We need vulnerability, but we need it to be appropriate. So we're going to talk about how do we stay safe and at the same time be connected. So should we share nothing or everything?
Everything. And so that's a really good question. Do we share everything or do we share nothing? And what about you? Where are you on this continuum from 1 to 10 on sharing nothing or everything? Think about that and get that number in your head so we can talk about it.
All right, so take a look at this scale again. This time it's color-coded. And if you look at this, you'll see that the ends, 1 and 10, are both red. They're red for a reason, because if there's nothing that we're sharing, well, then we really don't have a good way to have a connection with our teen. Now, on the other hand, if we're sharing everything, every misdeed, every teenage indiscretion, well, we maybe are sharing too much. In fact, we might even be so far as to be enmeshed, what psychologists call enmeshed. So we want to be somewhere in the middle of this scale. Now, is it a 5 exactly? Well, nobody probably ever gets that right. Whether you're at a 7 or a 3 or just somewhere roughly in the middle, that's where we want to be. We're never going to get it completely right, in part because what we should share and what we shouldn't share changes with circumstances.
Right. And so how do we know what should we share? As we think about it, we got to think about what are our reasons for sharing. The first reason may be that you want to share so that your teen can learn from your experience. You had an experience where you were really pushed by peer pressure, and what did you do, and how did that make you feel? And when they can learn that you've been through those same things, there's two pieces. They can learn from what you've done, and they also can feel that you're not so different from them. That really, when they feel alone, that they're the only person who's ever experienced this, and they go, wow, mom or dad experienced this before, they don't feel so different or so isolated. And you want to share because it builds intimacy, and it helps you have that connection with your teen so that you have a relationship. Now, while we know that there are reasons to share, the same goes. There are reasons that we shouldn't share. And those can be if it's harmful. We don't want to share something that's going to hurt someone else. We need to not say, well, I did this incredibly awful thing and I got away with killing somebody, but, don't worry about it. It's okay. Well, that's not a great idea. We don't want to one-upmanship anybody. And that can go both ways. It's not just that we're better. Well, we faced that, but we did it better than you. Or, oh my gosh, you had that experience. Well, I had this experience that was even more horrible than you. We don't want to do either of those things. We're not trying to be better or be better at having bad experiences. And we don't ever want to share things that are confidential to others. If there's something that we've told someone we won't share, then we don't want to share that with another person.
Yeah. At the heart of this vulnerability is a flow that I came across several years ago. We were having a conversation, some folks and I, about different ways that we could help people develop. And we mentioned really 3 words. And the first word was trust. And I thought, okay, that's a great word to talk about trust. Then the next thing was vulnerability. Great, we should talk about vulnerability. And we should talk about intimacy. And the thing was that these 3 things, to me, kind of instantly popped into this flow. They follow along an arrow. You have trust so that you can feel safe. And that safeness, that feeling of safety, leads to vulnerability, which in the end creates an intimacy. This idea that we want appropriate vulnerability, because we want to build a level of intimacy with our teen. And on the other hand, to even get to that vulnerability, well, we need trust on the other side of that. We need to have a level of trust that allows us to feel safe. And so, as we try this vulnerability thing, we have to remember that our end goal is to get to this thing called intimacy.
Right. Intimacy is really about a close connection. And that close connection is we're close, but we're still separate. Intimate people are in close proximity. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're next to each other. It could be, well, we are at the moment, but we could be on separate coasts and still be very connected and intimate. So it's about how do we feel connected to that person and still feel separate from them. You may go to work and your boss is on the other side of the desk, and that's separated. But then if you go together and work together on the same side of the table on a project working together, that's a closer intimacy. It's a connection between the two of you. And as we talk about that intimacy and that close connection, there are boundaries. We still are separate, but there are fewer boundaries between people that are closely connected than people that aren't intimate.
Right. And we see that in space as well. And so if we were to talk about personal space and where people are and how close we allow folks to each other, there's an intimate range that's less than 18 inches. You're going to have to be really comfortable with someone to get this close. If they're just within 4 feet, that's kind of a personal space. You're having a real conversation with another person. If you look at that from a 12-foot space, well, that's just social, right? Like, you'll be in the same room with someone. And beyond that is public space. And this all, by the way, comes from a book called Trust Me by Nick Morgan. And it really is designed to help you think about what would personal space, what would intimacy mean from a physical perspective. And the other part of that is you have to recognize that there are times and places, situations that will violate these boundaries. So think about a packed subway, right? You're literally standing shoulder to shoulder, and that's okay. That's what you expect to do. There's a level of trust on a subway that just happens. In fact, that might be basic trust.
Right. So that first level of trust, like in a subway, is an untested trust. You don't know the people around you. You don't know what they're going to do, but you trust that you're on a subway together. You're safe. It's okay to be in that close proximity. Another way of thinking about basic or implied trust is you hire a financial planner and you go to meet them the first time and you walk into their office and it's wood and it's very fancy and it's very elegant and you go, oh, well, they must know what they're doing with their money because they have this nice area. So you base trust on an assumption that just what you see is truth.
Right. And that sort of leads us to blind trust, which is where we don't test those assumptions, right? Maybe it's a person that can do no wrong. Maybe it's some situation, some organization that just can't do anything that is wrong for you. And you're not really looking at that. You're not really digging in deep and saying, oh, well, am I evaluating whether this person or the situation, this set of assumptions are the right things? You've said, I'm going to trust this and I'm not going to think about it again. And honestly, that's a pretty risky kind of trust. That's a kind of risky thing to do because you're not keeping any eyes on things. You're not ensuring that folks are worthy of that trust. And so blind trust really isn't where we want to be either. And that sort of leads us to this authentic or measured trust.
Right. And authentic trust is that trust that's built on experience of you've had that ability to grow a relationship. An example of this is we have a chow chow Nix. And Nix, when we eat on the deck, sits at the table in a chair and we sometimes put a plate of food in front of her. And we trust, based on our experience with her, that she's not going to eat that food until we tell her it's okay. And the same thing is, as she's sitting next to you at the table, she's not going to reach over and eat your food. Now, I wouldn't leave Nix at the table with everybody's plate on the table and go inside. My trust has that experience. It probably wouldn't be a good idea. But it's that measured and authentic trust built on experience that gets to be a really healthy place for relationships.
Right. And that authentic trust requires building. We've got to figure out a way to build that trust with other people. And part of that's experience, just experience in general. But there is a way to build trust with other people. There's a formula. There's a mechanism that you can leverage to build trust. And it's built brick by brick by brick or stone by stone by stone. You make a commitment and you meet the commitment. Like, hey, that's pretty easy. Well, even in those cases when it's not, when you have to renegotiate, because if you can't meet a commitment, you should renegotiate and you should do that early, right? Those little commitments, those little things build up over time and you end up with trust, right? Like, so trust is not built in a single moment. It's not a single thing. It's not one big monolith. It's brick by brick by brick. And unfortunately, a single mistake can lead to betrayal.
Right. And betrayal feels like such a strong word. It has a little bit of drama in it. But the truth is, betrayal is a strong word. And a breach of trust, when you've trusted someone to do what they said they were going to do and they don't, breaks down trust so quickly. So that pain is really about betrayal.
Right.
But then we find out that as we look at trust and we look at our relationships, how do we find that the value of that trust in a relationship is greater than the potential cost of the betrayal that you may feel? And that's when you find that choosing trust really becomes more valuable to you, and that a betrayal, while it hurts and it causes, there causes some friction, it's worth the risk to have that trust with the person.
Right. It's sort of a mathematical equation of emotions. And that leads us to vulnerability. So once we have the safety, once we have figured out that it's okay to be safe, recognizing that betrayals happen, then we're ready for vulnerability. And we have to think about vulnerability as something that is necessary. And I know you're like, hey, but I don't have to be vulnerable. No. Well, we'll get back to that in a moment. But for the moment, think about the fact that to feel safe, or rather to be vulnerable, you have to feel safe. To be vulnerable, you've got to feel like you are safe, right? And that is what we get from trust. That's the gift of trust, is that we get that safety so that we can be vulnerable. Now, I told you we'd come back to the need for vulnerability, and if you think, there's an old science magazine article, and it says where isolation alone is, quote, as significant to mortality rates as smoking, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, obesity, and the lack of physical exercise. Wow. Isolation. That's it. So if we can't be connected to people, if we can't be intimate with each other, which, remember, is on the other side of vulnerability, if we can't do that, well, maybe buying a life insurance policy. But so the thing is that barriers are to stop people from getting through, right? But every barrier, every single one, has gates, right? The Great Wall of China has all sorts of gates, right? Countries need trade. They need to be able to trade with other people. So there is some gated relationship where they interact, even if they want to be separate, right? People need our connections, right? We need our connections. As we said, it's a mortality risk to not be connected with people, to be isolated. And this last one is families need a level of openness, a level of intimacy, a level of connection that only comes through vulnerability. And if I were to quote John Duffy from The Available Parent, he said that some data suggests that a parent who talks with a teen about sex may delay intercourse for up to 2 years. Now, I'm not suggesting go talk to your kids about sex. That's not what this is about. It's about understanding that the more that you can have an honest, open conversation with your teens about any topic, the greater the chances are that they will resist it when they're confronted with it. And that level of conversation really is a conversation. It's an intimate conversation.
Right. And so that intimacy it's hard, but it's really about into me see. It's being able to see the real person. How do you be open and vulnerable so they can see who you really are? You're not putting on any false mask. You're being yourself. You're being honest and open, and you're being vulnerable, allowing them to see into you and who you really are, and being willing to see into them and who they are. That vulnerability requires some boundaries, right? It's not that we're the same person. There are some things that you don't share. There are some things that you do keep very separate. But we are vulnerable, and we have boundaries, and those boundaries have gates, just like we talked about before, is you have to have a way that people can get through to you. So if you build up a big wall, you have to have gates to let people through, to be vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think we've been talking about this from the point of view that you're not allowing enough intimacy with your child. But there is that other end of the spectrum, and the other end of that spectrum is where you're doing this thing called oversharing. And oversharing happens whenever you are sharing more than the other person can handle. Of course, we're talking about teenagers here, so they have less capacity for handling things than other people might. But this can happen even in our other relationships with other adults. And the second one, and this is probably most important with our children, is sharing more than is safe, right? Like, you don't really need to help them understand all the mistakes that you've made over the course of your life. You need to share those, as you said earlier, that help them learn from your experience. So sometimes sharing isn't the right answer. It's a thing about finding that balance between not enough and too much, right? In the end, appropriate vulnerability is a tool or the tool for developing intimacy. Intimacy with other people, with our teens, with anyone. We want to figure out how to share what we should share and not share what we shouldn't share when it's too much.
Right. Right. It's a hard balance.
It is a hard balance.
Finding the places with your kids that are enough, and you have a connection, you have an intimacy, and not too much.
Right.
But in the middle, that's what you need, that intimacy and connection.
Right. So that's what it's about, to be appropriately vulnerable, finding the balance in the middle. Thanks.